All right, so today we're starting session 4 of the Nurturing Skills module, Positive Discipline Practices and Techniques. Um, Today's session is on why parents spank their children, and then we'll be moving on to verbal and physical redirection. So the goal today is to increase parents' abilities to manage the behavior of their children using methods other than physical punishment. Today we're filming without participants just due to the sort of more sensitive nature of talking about physical punishment, which can be kind of a sensitive topic for folks. Um, so the warm-up today, and I'll ask Steve to respond to this, and then I'll take a minute to respond on my own, and would ask anybody who's viewing to just kind of pause for a moment and reflect on what their personal answers would be. Oops, there we go. So what messages did you receive about spanking as a child? And as a parent, what are your current views on spanking?
So for me, I remember spanked once, and it wasn't effective, and it made my dad feel worse, I think, than it made me feel. So I was not spanked. Other discipline methods were used primarily, which seemed to work better, which I and my wife have both carried into our parenting as well. We haven't spanked our children, and don't advocate for our oldest son to spank his new child. So.
Thanks, Steve. I think that as a young child, I was spanked. And I think what stuck out to me, a couple of things stood out to me in terms of like unspoken messages that came along with that. One of them that really stood out, I was always spanked for the same thing. And that was always fighting with my brother. And so for me, there was always some hypocrisy in this idea, like, don't fight with your brother. Lots of times our fights had gotten physical by the time mom sailed in with the paddle to spank us. And so, don't hit your brother, whack. Always stood out to me as like, well, that doesn't make any sense. And I think the other thing that maybe not as much as a child, but as an adult reflecting on that situation, I look back at it and think, man, if that had been an effective form of discipline, I probably would have been spanked one time for fighting with my brother. And instead, I was spanked, somewhat regularly for fighting with my brother. So I feel like there's some sort of a missing piece there. If it had been effective, it wouldn't have had to happen multiple times in order for me to get the message or learn the lesson. I think, we've been doing a lot of talking, and this goes to, as a parent, what are my views on spanking? For those who have been viewing the sessions before these, we've been doing a lot of talking about the intent of discipline being to teach and to guide. And in my mind, when siblings are fighting in particular, I think there are a lot of opportunities there to be teaching things like better communication skills and social skills and things like that. And spanking never taught us any of those things. Um, you know, it just didn't teach me how to bring any kind of peaceful resolution to any of the problems that my brother and I were having. It just didn't do the trick in terms of teaching and guiding. So as a parent, my views on spanking are that I don't want to be the cause of any physical pain for my kids, and also that there are just some much more effective methods that we could be using as parents. So that's my point of view. So we're going to spend some time talking about spanking as punishment. And so I'm going to try to switch here to a whiteboard so that I can hopefully record some thoughts that we have around spanking. So, Steve, when you think about spanking or other forms of physical punishment, what are some words that come to mind?
Whipping, whooping.
Sorry, I wondered which one you said, but I figured we better just get them both on the board.
Yeah. Paddling.
Yes, that's the one my mom favored.
Um,
I think there's like hitting,
yep.
beating,
Within your
um,
Oh, ass beating.
wow, Steve's going there.
Yep. I'm going there.
Yeah. So,
Oh, switch.
oh, a switch. Yeah. Right. I hear a lot of people say, my parents never did this, but I hear a lot of people say, I think particularly if they were physically punished by like the older generation, their grandparents and things like that,
Mhm.
that they would have to go pick their switch,
Yep.
go pick your switch and bring it back, and then you get punished with that.
Yep.
So, all right, we're gonna take a closer look at a few of these concepts, namely sort of the variations between spanking, hitting, and beating, just to name a few, just to isolate a couple for argument's sake. So I'm gonna go back to the screen for a second. So I think one thing that's important to recognize when we talk about spanking, and I think this visual helps us to see it a little bit better. So Steve, can I ask you a question?
Yeah.
On mine, our faces are covering the number 10.
You can move that.
Okay, but is where I put mine, does it affect where you have yours?
Nope.
Okay, so I know there's number 10 under there. All right, so if we take a look at this continuum, which goes from 0 to 10, and 0 is the complete absence of spanking. Really, it probably should say the complete absence of any type of physical punishment at all. And, I guess things that we didn't mention maybe on our brainstorm list that come up a lot when I talk to parents about various forms of spanking would be like a slap on the hand. Some people will call it a swat on the butt. And again, I think these things probably have different meaning for different people. But generally speaking, in our society, I think people consider a tap on the hand, a swat on the butt to be towards the lower end of this spectrum in terms of severity. So 0 would be complete absence of any of those sort of physical techniques to reprimand a child. And then as you climb up towards the 10, you've got things like a slap on the hand, a swat on the butt, and then it gets maybe a little more aggressive as you climb in numbers to a full-on spanking, hitting a child, and beating as you go further up the line. And I think the stark reality of this that most of us cringe to have to think of is if you get all the way to 10 on this spectrum, where you land is the death of a child as a result of a physical punishment. And no one wants to think about it getting there. It's a very dark place to have to go in your mind. But I think it's also a necessary reality check for us to think about where this can go when the process of spanking goes further than swatting a child on the butt, or, you know, a switch or something like that, because sadly it does happen. Um, so, um, sorry, I'm just checking my notes real quick to make sure I'm not missing anything. I think it's not so important really what number you assign to each of these different things. You know, one person, maybe based on their own personal experiences, might put a spanking at a 5 on the scale, and another person might say, oh no, you know, my mom or dad spanked me, you knew you were getting spanked, that was a 7. So I think there's some individual variation in the numbers that people would assign, but I think generally speaking, we can all kind of imagine the progression of aggression or violence as some of these um, physical discipline techniques unfold. And because of that, I think this doesn't come out of the curriculum. This is like basically my opinion. I think that the continuum should look like this instead. Instead of just being a straight on horizontal line, I feel like this should be a diagonal line, because I think this can be a really slippery slope. I think that particularly when you're talking about the kind of aggression that leads to the death of a child. I've never personally interviewed anyone who has gotten that type of physically aggressive with a child, but I'm willing to bet that if you did, they never intended to land there when they started getting aggressive with a child. My guess is most of those people, if you spend some time talking to them, um, would say, you know, they started off trying to discipline the child physically, maybe here and around this zone, and something happened to escalate the aggression and the violence in the situation. Whether that something is something unexpected happened. For example, one thing we hear a lot is when parents are recounting stories of their physical punishment that they endured when they were kids. I've heard a lot of parents say things like, I was getting a spanking and I laughed in my mom's face, or said something like, is that the best you've got? And then she unleashed on me, right? So this idea that sometimes kids don't respond to a spanking in the way that we expected them to, and their response to it maybe escalates the parent's response even more. It triggers some sort of real stressful emotion for the parent, and their anger turns into rage. And rage is what happens when you've lost control, and then you find yourself increasing the aggression of the physical punishment that you are perpetrating on a child. So for that reason, that's why I feel like this should be a sloped continuum. I think that once you open the door utilizing physical discipline with a child, it can be a very slippery slope that you never intended to slide down. And you could find yourself maybe not all the way down here to 10, but maybe much further along than you intended to be, and much further along than in reflection you're really comfortable with having gotten with a kiddo. So for those reasons, the approach of this nurturing parenting curriculum is that spanking is an abusive process. And regardless of whether or not it leaves a mark on a child, because, in some like official capacities, that might be the determining factor as to whether or not something is considered abuse, whether or not there was any mark left on the child. But the position of the Family Resource Center and the position of the Nurturing Skills curriculum is really that regardless of whether or not it left any kind of a physical mark on the child, that getting aggressive in that way in the name of discipline is an abusive process, and it often can get carried further than we intended it to. Do you have
And the
anything
other,
to add to that?
yeah, the other comment I'd like to make is, so we know in the eyes of the authorities that the determining factor between discipline and abuse is kind of that leave a mark thing.
Mm-hmm.
However, the problem with that is every single individual is different.
Mm-hmm.
So I could spank somebody the exact same way Trish spanks somebody, and it may or may not leave a mark because I'm different. Trish is different. And we could spank the exact, you know, I could get spanked and it leaves a mark, and she could get spanked and it doesn't leave a mark because we're all different. So it's a very rudimentary, biased way of determining what is and isn't abuse.
Yeah, there's a lot of gray in that, right?
There's
When
a
we're using
lot of
that
gray.
as the determining factor.
Yeah, it's really left up to that individual, which is, it's not a, it's gray. It's very gray. So we, keep that in mind as well.
Yeah. It's interesting, I talk to, a lot of parents who have different opinions on spanking or using, physical disciplinary techniques with kids. And I try to be very respectful of people's opinions, whether I agree with them or not. But it's always interesting to me when I speak to someone who is an advocate of using physical discipline, and then I ask them, well, what if, for example, your child got in trouble at school? Would you be okay with the teacher or the administrator at school using physical discipline on your child? And generally speaking, people have a very strong reaction to my suggestion that anyone else get physical with their child, which is always interesting to me. This idea like, well, it's okay for me to spank my child, but it's not okay for anyone else to spank my child on my behalf. I don't know. It just, again, I think speaks to sort of the inconsistency or hypocrisy of using physical discipline with kids. It just has never really sat well or made sense to me. If we're not comfortable with teachers teaching and guiding our children in that way, if we expect the other prominent role models in their lives to exercise more restraint and use different techniques with them than that, then why shouldn't we at home be held to that same standard? I feel like everyone should be held to that same standard in terms of finding productive, effective, nonviolent ways of addressing undesirable behavior in kids. So, Steve, do you want to take a few minutes to go through why parents do spank their kids? Because I think there are some pretty common core reasons that people will cite for spanking kids, but I don't think their arguments always hold up.
Yeah, sure. So a lot of there's a lot of reasons parents spank their kids. I think a very common reason is personal history. So parents who were spanked tend to use the same techniques with their children. We kind of come away with the mentality that, well, it worked for me, or it didn't harm me in any way, so it must be okay. So we do it with our kids.
Yeah, I hear that a lot. My parents spanked me, and look how great I turned out.
Right. Yep. And we're certainly not saying otherwise, but just because somebody does something one way doesn't necessarily mean that it's the best way to do it.
Yeah. And for that reason, I really applaud, people who reach out and take classes such as this, because
Right.
oftentimes we do use the same parenting strategies that our parents use, simply because, as people have discussed for generations, kids do not come with manuals.
Right.
And the only way that we often know how to parent is by emulating the models that we had in our childhoods, usually our parents. And unless we take some proactive steps like enrolling in parenting classes, we don't always know what alternatives are out there. So,
Right.
yeah.
And for those of you that are that watch this and know me, you hear me say a lot about teachable moments. And for me, life is full of teachable moments. So I referenced earlier, my son has a new baby, him and his wife. She's 7 weeks old. And I see him starting to make some of the same mistakes that I made as a parent, as a young parent. And I tell him, I try to teach him about, why he shouldn't do whatever. And he says to me, well, you did it with me and I turned out fine. And my response to him is, you turned out fine, but you could have turned out better.
Yeah.
Like I don't want my kids to make the same mistakes that I made. So it's about
Right.
those teachable moments.
Yeah.
Um,
And people who similarly who know me know that my family functions on humor. That's sort of what makes the world go round in our house. So when my older children say things like, well, you did that with me, I usually have a comeback like, well, you were my starter child. I've learned a lot since then.
yeah, I've used that too, actually. Um, so that actually leads to the next one, which is to teach right from wrong. Um, we've talked about the reason for discipline, which is to teach and guide. So if we don't want our kids to hit, why are we hitting them to teach them not to hit? It is confusing for a child. For adults, we have the cognitive ability to be able to reason that out.
Mhm.
Kids don't have that ability yet.
Yeah.
So it's important that we mean what we say and do what we say, right?
Yes.
There's an expression, I can't think of it right now. Say what we mean and mean what
Mean what we say. Ding,
mean
ding,
what we
ding.
say.
Yeah.
Yeah, there we go. Sorry. It's been a long week.
It's okay. It's only
Um,
Tuesday, Steve.
yeah, I know. I know. Any other
Um,
thoughts on that one, Trish?
yeah, I mean, I think, beyond just teaching kids not to get aggressive, we're going to spend some time in a little bit talking about redirection and teaching kids what to do instead of what not to do. But for me, this idea of teaching them right from wrong goes back to what I was saying in the very beginning about always getting spanked for fighting with my brother. Getting spanked didn't teach me any new problem solving skills, negotiation skills, communication skills. Those were the things that I would have needed to be successful in those situations when I had conflict with my brother. Spanking me didn't teach me any of those vital skills. It taught me how fast I had to run in order to beat my mom to my bedroom before she could catch me in the hallway. That's really the only lesson I think I learned from getting spanked. And also, if you're getting spanked with a wooden paddle, don't put your hands over your butt, because it hurts more to get your knuckles wrapped with a wooden paddle than it does to just take it on your soft, squishy bum.
Yeah.
So, not the lessons my mom intended to teach with that punishment, but yeah, it never taught me the essential skills that I was
Right.
missing.
And one of the things that the primary lesson that corporal punishment, so spanking is a form of corporal punishment, but other forms of negative punishment teach is they really teach kids how to get away with stuff. And that's not what we want to teach our kids. We want to teach our kids more effective ways of getting their needs met, because you've heard us say this before. Behavior is nothing more than a response to a need. So we need to teach them more appropriate and effective ways of getting their needs met, not getting around something. And that's what corporal punishment really does, is it just teaches kids how to run faster to get away.
Mm.
All right. So next one is as a form of punishment. So it's the only form of punishment they really know. Um, Parents may fear that if they don't spank, there's nothing else they can do, and they will lose total control over their children's behavior. And I would tend to encourage anyone listening to this to think of this in kind of a different way, that um, by spanking, you actually have greater tendency of increasing the loss of control over your child. It creates power struggles, and it creates, like I said prior, kids learning how to get away with stuff rather than learning why they shouldn't do it. To teach them respect.
Oops, mine must be out of order.
Nope, I
Oh
missed
no,
it.
as an act of
That's my fault. As an act of love. So I find this one interesting, but parents have a deep concern for their child's well-being and spank out of desperation. This hurts me more than it hurts you. It's for your own good. One day you'll thank me for this. Unfortunately, this teaches children to accept that love can be shown in abusive ways, which is a dangerous attitude for them to have as they approach future relationships. Again, this is another kind of it's a little bit hypocritical, because we know hitting is not respectful. And if we're doing it to teach, sorry, I just jumped to the next one. If we're using it in that way, love is all about respect. Love is all about, mutual respect. And it really ties in to that. So.
Yeah. I think for me, the last part of this is what really hits home. When I'm thinking about um, interactions that my kids have in the early years of their life, really laying the foundation for their impressions the rest of their lives. One of the very last associations that I ever want to contribute to making in their little minds is that there's a relationship between love and aggression.
Exactly.
I do not want my kids to walk into the world thinking that love can be shown in abusive ways, because
Right.
I think we're just setting them up for a lifetime of relationships where they play the role as a victim. And I don't
Yeah.
want that for my kids.
And one of the things that, again, I think it's really important to teach our kids is that being held accountable is not abusive. Like, being held accountable is loving if it's done in a loving, respectful manner. So discipline, as we are teaching, is a very respectful, loving thing that we should do for our kids. Spanking doesn't necessarily fit into that category.
Great.
All right, so the next one is to teach them respect. So we've talked a little bit about this, but violence does not teach respect, it teaches fear. It also teaches that violence is a good way to get people to do what you want. In order to get respect, we must model it. This goes back to that point of teaching. Our kids tend to become us. Maybe not 100%, but I mean, I look at some things that I took away from my parents' parenting style that I kind of wish I didn't. And I look at some pieces that I did take away that I'm really glad that they modeled for me. So it's just being conscientious of what are we modeling for our kids. And then because they are angry, so when anger turns to rage, the ability to stay in control is lost, and children are at risk of becoming seriously hurt. Parents must model alternative strategies for handling anger. So if we go back to when Trish turned the continuum kind of on a diagonal, that's what really comes to my mind, because when we start getting angry, our thinking shifts from the frontal part of our brain, which is our cognitive abilities. This is where we have control. It shifts to the back part of our brain where we have just that reptilian part. It's the fight or flight. And, you'll hear people say, well, I blacked out. I don't remember what I did. That testosterone or that
Adrenaline.
adrenaline, thank you, takes over, and we can't always control it. So that's why Trish turns that continuum on its angle like that, because it can slide, but we're still accountable to it if we can't control it. And then, so this one's kind of near and dear to my heart, based on religious beliefs. So there is a proverb in the Bible, spare the rod, spoil a child. So often this is misrepresented, misinterpreted, as encouraging physical punishment. So the rod is actually a tool that was used by a shepherd, and it was meant to direct the sheep, and guide them and move them and teach them to go in this direction versus the other, which is exactly what discipline is, right? It's teaching and guiding. So that is it's not a biblical reason to spank our kids. So there we go.
Why does this keep going backwards there?
And then based on cultural practice. So this is one that's can be a little tricky sometimes, because sometimes we have people that come from other cultures, other parts of the world where spanking it's accepted. It's very much part of the normalcy of parenting. And it's widespread throughout their culture. So, but it's not a unique expression of cultural identity. So I don't know if you want to speak a little more to that, Trish.
Yeah, I think just the idea here is, some people will sort of hold up their cultural ideas as justification for using physical punishment, but really physical punishment is very pervasive across cultures. It's not something that I think we can hold up and say, this is what my people do, because literally people everywhere are doing this. It's not something that is unique that we need to sort of perpetuate in order to retain our cultural identity. There are lots of other traditions and things like that we want to encourage families to retain in order to maintain that sense of cultural identity through the generations. But hitting kids doesn't have to be one of those. That's something that cultures everywhere do. It's not something that distinguishes your culture from other people's.
And I say this carefully. I won't use any specific examples because I don't want to bring up anything, but we can look throughout the course of history, and there's all kinds of things that have come out of a cultural norm that we can say that wasn't very healthy, right? That wasn't very good. So just because it's part of a cultural norm at one point in time doesn't mean that we should continue to practice it.
Sure, absolutely.
Yeah.
Oops.
And then the last one is to prepare them for the real world. So this is another one that I have an interesting. Parents believe that they need to toughen their kids up to deal with the cruel world in which they live. In reality, if we eliminate violence in the home, the world would be less violent. So again, it goes back to that modeling piece. Are we modeling anger? Are we modeling that kind of that physical punishment piece, or are we modeling more peaceful methods of solving problems like talking, communicating, expressing feelings, things like that?
I'm looking for, there's a quote that I love on this. Give me 1 second.
Yep.
I wish I had put it in the slideshow. It was something that you said brought it up for me. And I am famous at butchering quotes if I don't have it in front of me. Here it is. So it's not our job to toughen our children up to face a cruel and heartless world. It's our job to raise children who will make the world a little less cruel and heartless.
Mm.
For me, that really sums it up. I'm not gonna, armor plate my child so that they can sort of withstand the awfulness of the world around them. I'm going to do my very best to turn them into the kind of human being that's going to change that awfulness.
Right.
I don't
Yep.
know if awfulness is a word, but I just used it three times now.
You just used it. Yeah, absolutely.
Rolled it right out there like it was.
So at this point, we're gonna talk about ways in which we can kind of shift our thinking from this kind of corporal punishment that we've been talking about, such as spanking, to more healthy and effective ways. So we're going to talk about redirection. So there's two types of redirection that we're really going to focus on. Verbal redirection, which is when we use our words to tell children what is and what is not acceptable and what is acceptable. And then physical redirection is where we actually remove a child from a dangerous activity or and substitute more appropriate activities. So I'm going to go on that one first, because I always, whenever we talk about this, I always think of the toddler that goes straight for the raging, burning wood stove, right? Mm-hmm. Happens every time. They go straight for it. And what do? We pick them up and we carry them away from it and set them down, right? So we physically redirected them. But what we didn't do more often than not is redirect them to another activity that meets their needs of curiosity. They want to know what that hot thing is, right? Or for whatever reason, it looks interesting to them. So their need is to figure out what that is. They're curious. So when we do the right thing by picking them up and moving them away because it's dangerous, but where we tend to forget is we need to give them something else to do. Because if we don't, right back at that stove, and all we're doing all day is chasing them, and then they like the attention that they get, so they just keep doing it. So it's this self-perpetuating cycle. We need to figure out, what can we give them? What activity can we give them that's safe and that tries to work towards their need or their goal of going towards that hot stove? Anything to add there, Trish?
Yeah, no, I think that, that, like you said, that piece that we often miss is the engagement in something else. And toddlers in particular, although they, have seemingly short attention spans, it seems like when they have their mind set on something that we don't want them to have, they have the longest attention span in the world. They, will never forget about it. So it really does become a matter of redirecting them and investing the time to engage them in something different so that their attention really shifts and locks in somewhere else.
A great example was actually a participant in one of our prior classes brought this up. They were having a hard time with their toddler when they were cooking. The toddler was always trying to be in the kitchen. They would stick their hands up on the counter when the parent was using knives. And what they did was they ended up setting up a spot in the kitchen kind of away from where the real cooking was happening. And I lost my train of thought.
Ice makers will do that to you.
Stay at home, love it. So the child would have fake vegetables and fake knives, and they would be doing the same thing that their parent was doing, right?
Sure, a play kitchen. It's a great
Yeah, so
idea.
this is great on a lot of different levels. One, it keeps them busy and focused. And two, it's letting them model what you're doing or you're modeling to them, and they're learning those skills, right? So it's great on a lot of different levels.
Yeah. I like to refer to that as honoring the intent of the
Yes.
child's action, right? So you're recognizing the unmet need, which is to spend time in the kitchen with you, to be like mommy and daddy and do the things that they're doing, to be so grown up and things like that. Those are the needs that the child is trying to meet by constantly being under your feet in the kitchen. And so, how can we meet those needs in a way that, honors the intent of the behavior that does need to be redirected because it's not safe? And so, setting up a little play kitchen, or if you don't have the resources to set up a play kitchen, setting up one or two cupboards or drawers that are filled with just the plastic Tupperware and the pots and pans lids and the wooden spoons and things like that. These are your cabinets.
Yep.
These cabinets are for mommy and daddy. These cabinets are yours. Here, you sit down and make me dinner while I make you dinner. That's the sort of thing that would very likely engage a child, and honor the intent of why they're under your feet in the kitchen in the first place.
Yep. Absolutely. So another piece of physical redirection is actually verbal redirection. So when we, move that kid away from that hot stove, we say, "Oh no, Johnny, hot," right? We give them some verbal communication to let them know why we're moving them.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm,
Um, Sometimes, I think all the time, physical redirection should come with verbal redirection.
mm,
Because if we're just physically moving them and not telling them anything, we're not teaching them anything necessarily. They need to know why. Kids need to know the why behind the behavior. But verbal redirection could come all on its own. So if it's, your kid's being really loud and you're on the phone, "Oh, Johnny, can you quiet down, please? I'm on the phone," right? Just some verbal redirection.
mm-hmm.
It's polite. It's, not yelling because again, we're modeling, right? We don't want them to yell. So if we yell at them, what are we teaching? So the way in which we redirect is very important.
Mm. So the very bottom of this slide, it says the technique works best for very young kids and it's less effective after the age of 3. I feel like that's another place where I maybe differ a little bit in opinion from the curriculum. I agree that I think redirection should be the go-to technique for parents who have kids, between the ages of 1 and 3. That should be most likely where you start all the time when you're running into situations where kids are showing challenging behaviors. That window between 1 and 3, or really when they start to get mobile and about 3, their whole job during that period of time is to learn to understand the world. And we have to be constantly teaching them these things by redirecting them from inappropriate activities to appropriate activities. But after the age of 3, I think that redirection can still be a really valid technique in a lot of situations. It's not always going to take the place of consequences, but if you've been listening to these recordings the last couple of sessions, right, one of my famous sayings when it comes to discipline is don't kill a housefly with a bazooka. Why, when a child is showing some sort of an inappropriate behavior, we're not going to pull out the big guns right away. We're going to start small, see what's effective, and build up from there if we need to. Sometimes the redirection, correcting them, letting them know what's not appropriate and what they should be doing instead is all that we need. And if that's all that we need, why escalate to a situation where we're imposing all kinds of consequences and stuff like that? Lots of times this is all the kids need to be taught or guided. And as a person who has spent, a lot of time in a classroom, I taught kindergarten and first grade for 15 years. Those kids were anywhere between 5 years old and sometimes up to 8 years old. And we were constantly using redirection in the classroom. And you think about the number of times that, kids are in the hallway and they're running instead of walking down the hallway like the school rules. I'm not whipping out consequences every time a kid is running down the hallway. I'm going to stop them and remind them we use walking feet in the hallway, and off they go. That's a form of verbal redirection for a kid. And for most of them, that's all that's really required. So this idea that it's not effective after the age of 3, nah, I object a little bit. I think that there's time and place. I think that physical redirection probably gets less like logistically useful. We're not like picking up 8-year-olds and removing them to different situations. Although I still will, my daughter's 9, and from time to time, I'll gently grab her hand and walk away with her while I'm redirecting her to a different activity. So, take it for what it's worth, I guess. But
Yep.
I just don't want parents to think if their kid is older than 3 that they're automatically throwing this technique in the trash can, because
Right.
I do think that it has a place.
And I'm going to be real honest. I'm 44 and my wife uses verbal redirection on me all the time.
Amen. So do I.
It's a technique that we use as human beings, whether we're young, old, whatever. It's a good technique. And the other thing that when Trish was talking about the young child running in the hallway, I hear parents sometimes say, well, all I do is verbally redirect them. I constantly tell them the same thing over and over again. When are they going to learn? When they're an adult. I mean, and that's not, kids forget things. Kids need constant reminders. I need constant reminders. It's just, I know it's frustrating, but
Yeah.
If it's like blatant, disregard for respect and authority, that's different. But if it's just kids being kids,
Yeah.
seeing each other down the hallway, I mean,
Yeah. I think too, bless you, that to a certain extent, this idea that, parents are getting very frustrated with having to repeatedly give the same reminders or give the same directions is perhaps a moment that requires some empathy in your parenting too, because, different children are going to respond to that in different ways. If you have a child who is struggling with an attentional disorder, for example, trying to maintain some sensitivity around the fact that that child has a legitimate biological reason that it is challenging for him or her to be retaining directions or following through with what you've asked them to do. Doesn't excuse them from having to live up to the expectations, but maybe, just invokes a little bit of empathy for the child, that perhaps they're not going to respond to those reminders in the same way that their sibling does or something like that. Likewise, kids who have experienced trauma in their childhoods will respond to disciplinary techniques much differently and may need more empathy, more reminders, more monitoring of how you say what you say, that sort of thing. So just, I guess, a general reminder for parents to be mindful that not every kid is the same, and that there are some special circumstances that may require us to be more patient or patient in a different way with some kids than others. And I think the other piece of redirection that maybe we haven't hit home all the way is the key to redirection is not just the no, stop, don't that we often use with kids. It's making sure that you are very intentionally telling the child what they should do instead, right? So you're not just telling the child, stop running in the hall, stop fighting with your brother, don't touch the hot stove. The second half of this is teach the child what they should be doing instead. Because for some kids, it may seem obvious to us. I just asked you to stop doing that. And then the child will start doing something else that is also unacceptable. Very frustrating to an adult. Often comes off as the kids being a wise guy of some sort, well, obviously when I told you to stop doing this, I didn't mean to start doing that. Well, sometimes we just really have to be very explicit with kids. Their whole job is learning where the boundaries are in their lives. And so rather than leaving that as a guessing game for them, well, she told me to stop doing this, so let's see if this other idea is okay. Let's just do them a favor and skip that step and be explicit with them.
And remember, behavior is nothing more than our way to get needs met. So they're not just being punks. Mm-hmm. Maybe they are just being punks, but
there's something more to it than that.
Yeah, there's more to it than that. Maybe they're trying to get some attention. Maybe they're scared. Maybe they're bored. Mm-hmm. So maybe they don't understand. Maybe they need more teaching. So some redirection scenarios. A 3-year-old playing too roughly with the cat. What words would you use to verbally redirect the child? Trish?
This is kind of a trick question for me because I wouldn't just verbally redirect the child. I would model at the same time, which is kind of a physical redirection. Mm-hmm. But for me, it wouldn't just be about leave the cat alone, leave the cat alone, leave the cat alone. If the child is playing too roughly with the cat, he or she is obviously very interested in the cat. So I want to teach the child how to interact appropriately with the cat. Look how much the cat likes it when you start up by his ears and run your hand all the way down to his tail. Cats like to be patted that way, not the other way. And this cat doesn't like it when you touch his feet or go near his whisk, whatever it is. That child is trying to learn how to be buddies with the cat. I already know how to be buddies with the cat, so let me teach you. Let me show you. This is how the cat likes to be patted.
Yep, absolutely. Okay, so 3-year-old banging on computer keys. What steps would you take to physically redirect the child?
So for me, I think you can take this in 2 different directions in terms of physically redirecting. So I think one thing would be to say, we can't bang on the computer keys. Here, let's go get your drum. It looks like you want to do some banging. Let's go get your drum and we'll bang on that instead. Honoring the intent of what the child wants to do, right? Engages them in something else that feels interesting. I think the other direction you could go is, boy, it looks like you're really curious about mommy's computer. Here, let me show you how I use one finger and gently touch one key at a time. So in one scenario, I'm substituting something that the child can be a little rough with. And in the other scenario, I'm just showing him how he can touch mommy's computer, not just leave it alone.
Right. Yep, absolutely. All right. And 2-year-old playing on the stairs. What steps would you take to physically redirect the child?
Yeah. So again, thinking about honoring the intent of the child. If you've got a kiddo who is climbing up the stairs, and you're, constantly saying, hey, come down here, we're playing downstairs, or I don't want you playing on the stairs because I don't want you to fall. it seems to me like that child's got some energy they're trying to get out. So rather than just continuously saying, we're not climbing on the stairs right now, I would be thinking, how can I give this child some physical activity that would be appropriate? Maybe we need to go outside and run some of that energy out. Or maybe if that's not feasible, we just need to take all of the sofa cushions off of the sofa and pile them on the floor and let him climb up and over and down and around those instead, if you think that's a safer alternative to him climbing on the stairs. And for me, I think that also leads to another point, which is we really can do kids a favor by making sure that the environment is appropriate for them so that we don't have to keep saying, no, stop, don't, no,
Right.
stop, don't. That's exhausting for a parent. It's
Yep.
straining on the relationship between the parent and the child. Make your life a little bit easier, especially if you have toddlers, and do some serious child proofing whenever and wherever you can.
Yeah,
So that you don't have to keep saying, get off the stairs.
Yeah. One of the additional points under redirection is with toddlers in particular, set up environments so they can be successful. So we want to try to limit the word no.
Mm-hmm.
You know,
Sorry.
Go ahead.
I remember the summer that my daughter was 2.5. I was a public school teacher, so I was home for the summer, and about, on, I think it was like day 2 of summer vacation, I called my husband in desperation because her little fingers were just the right size to be picking those outlet plugs out of the outlet. And that was like her activity for the day, was just as fast as I would put those little outlet covers in, she would go behind me and pull those little outlet covers out again. And I finally just rearranged our house because I couldn't get the outlet covers to stay in, and I didn't want her to be playing with them, and I didn't want to keep telling her no. I just moved some furniture. Like, I just covered up every outlet in our house so that we could move on with our lives in peace for a little while. Sometimes you just have to modify your environment.
Yeah. Absolutely. All right. Is that the end of the scenarios?
It is, yes.
Okay. So I guess that's it.
Yeah.
For today.
It is. So a takeaway, I guess, for people who are viewing the recording, what is one new idea related to either using spanking as punishment, something you hadn't considered before, or something about redirection that you're thinking about after having viewed this class? So just a moment of self-reflection, I guess.
Yep, absolutely. All
so
right.
For people who are sort of following the series, next week will be the last week of new material in this module. So one more recorded class in this module, and it will really be a review of concepts that we have introduced thus far. All right.
All right.
So if everybody has a great day. Have a good day, Steve.
Bye. You too.
So it's nice to see you.